Hi Booktube and welcome to a new video. This is an original tag video that I've created. This is called the Literary Quotation Contrarian tag, and there's only one prompt or challenge, and it's to do with some of your favourite quotes in literature. And I'll expand on the nature of the prompt in a minute. But let's define what we mean by literature. So we do not mean quotes by politicians from their speeches. We do not mean quotes by newspaper columnists airing their unwanted opinions. We're talking about things that have appeared in literature, be it poetry or fiction, stage plays, or even non-fiction. So any literary source for your quotes. And as to how many, that's entirely up to you, between 5 and 10, or just one if there's one that you're particularly struck with. It depends on the length you want to make your video, I suppose. And the hub of the thing is contrarian. So in my case, I have taken 10 or 11 quotes which I fundamentally disagree with, and I'll explain why for each of them in quite short, pithy measure. All the quotes in my case are taken from the Oxford Book of Death by DJ Enight, which I finished reading this week, other than one, which is The Art of Death by Edwidge Danticat. And that is not because we live in perilous times with the coronavirus. Both of these books bookended, I should say, my own current work in progress, which I finished last week. The Danticat book was the inspiration born out of contrary opposition to everything in it for my 40,000 word novella on death, and I picked this up after I'd finished my writing to see if I'd sort of missed anything out that I wanted to say, maybe get some pointers for sort of pithy straplines for marketing. So all mine are themed, but yours do not have to be themed. They could just be some of your favourite quotes. And it is a contrarian tag, so they don't actually, if you don't want to, have to be quotes you disagree with. They could be quotes that move you, you fundamentally agree with, you live your life by. The choice is yours, we are contrarians. Go in whichever direction you want to take this tag. And that, even if that means if you want to talk about quotes that, you favour, that means we have to include self-help books. Yes, I'll make an exception and allow stuff from self-help books, but only if you're going to be praising them. I don't think there's any point doing contrary self-help tags. Okay, so on to my choices. So I'm starting with Epicurus, who does feature in my novel, as many of these do. Okay, so this is the quote from Epicurus. Would be if I was on the right page. Okay. This is from his letter to Menocius. So death, the most terrifying of ills, is nothing to us, since so long as we exist, death is not with us. But when death comes, then we do not exist. It does not then concern either the living or the dead, since for the former it is not, and the latter are no more. Okay, so what do I disagree with about that? So death, the most terrifying of ills, correct, agree with that, is nothing to us. Well, if it's the most terrifying of ills, how can it be nothing? But okay. Since so long as we exist, death is not with us. Well, that's not true. What he means is we haven't died, in that sense, death is no longer with us, but inside our heads it can be very present. But when death comes, then we do not exist. Well, I agree with that. It does not then concern either the living or the dead, since for the former it is not, and the latter are no more. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all. It does not then concern either the living. Well, it does, because he's argued that because death isn't in existence during your life, which it is, obviously, because people around you die, but your own death is in existence, it shouldn't concern you, doesn't hold. And the latter are no more, and they have no consciousness to be aware of. Well, I agree with that. Okay, so on to William Hazlitt as the second quote on death. Perhaps the best cure for the fear of death is to reflect that life has a beginning as well as an end. There was a time when we were not. This gives us no concern. Why then should it trouble us that a time will come when we shall cease to be? There's more of the quote, but I just want to take that up. So it's certainly true that before we were conceived and grown in the womb and came out into the world, we had no concern because we weren't conscious at all. That's true. I don't disagree with that. But then he argues, why then should it trouble us that a time will come when we shall cease to be? Well, William, because we've lived our allotted span of lives, developing our loves, attachments, identity, all sorts of things we think make living worthwhile. It does trouble us when that is about to be brought to an end by death. Carry on his quote. I have no wish to have been alive 100 years ago or in the reign of Queen Anne. Why should I regret and lay so much to heart that I shall not be alive 100 years hence in the reign of who I cannot tell? To die is only to be as we were before we were born. Well, it isn't, for the reasons I've explained. Yet no one feels any remorse or regret or repugnance in contemplating this last idea. Well, we do. It is rather a relief and disburthening of the mind. It seems to have been a holiday time with us then. We were not called to appear upon the stage of life, to wear robes or tatters, to laugh or cry, be hooted or applauded. We had lain perdu all this while, snug out of harm's way, and had slept out our thousands of centuries without wanting to be waked up. At peace and free from care, in a long non-age, in a sleep deeper and calmer than that of infancy, wrapped in the finest and softest dust. And the worst that we dread is, after a short, fretful, feverish being, after vain hopes and idle fears, to sink the final repose again and forget the troubled dreams of life. Well, the problem is, as I say, that we have lived a life, and therefore, first of all, I reject the notion that they're slumbers, both before we're born and after we've died, but I'll come to that in another quote. Problem is, William, all the things you list as being a disburdening or an unburdening, we were not called to appear upon the stage of life, to wear robes or tatters, to laugh or cry, be hooted or applauded. Well, they are what make life worth living. So to sort of tamely acquiesce in that being snatched away doesn't wash with me, I'm afraid. A sleep deeper and calmer than that of infancy, wrapped in the finest and softest dust. What the soil of the earth is, there's no consolation in that. The fact that you're at peace, you have no more thoughts, be they troubling or be they joyous. That I find personally is a problem. And the worst that we dread is, after a short, fretful, feverish being, after vain hopes and idle fears, to sink to final repose again and forget the troubled dream of life. So he seems to be saying that sleep of the grave, as in the sleep before birth, are dreamless, and it's life that is dream-laden, both conscious and unconscious in our sleep. I don't buy it. Okay, on to the next one. Simone de Beauvoir, the one quote that I've taken from Danticat. This is from her book A Very Easy Death, an account of the final weeks of her mother's life. There is no such thing as a natural death. You do not die from being born, nor from having lived, nor from old age. You die from something. Cancer, thrombosis, pneumonia. It is as violent and unforeseen as an engine stopping in the middle of the sky. Well, that's sort of true, except for the one line which rather undermines it, where she says, you do not die from being born. Well, you do. Because when you're born, the sort of cluster of DNA that has formed the you, the physical you, yes, it grows from embryo to baby to toddler to adolescent to adult, but all of those processes are, ticking down the clock of mortality. So the moment you're born, you will die. You absolutely will die at some point in your life. So I think she's wrong on that. I don't take my views on it as sort of orthodoxy. This is from Francis Quarles, 1592 to 1644, from hieroglyphics of the life of man. Forbear, fond taper, what thou seeks is fire, thy own destruction's lodged in thy desire. Thy wants are far more safe than their supply. He that begins to live, begins to die. So like me, Francis Quails begs to differ with Simone de Beauvoir. Okay, on to Wittgenstein, page 8 of the Oxford book. And I have to say, I deal with this at length in my novel. Okay. Death is not an event of life. Death is not lived through. If by eternity is understood not endless temporal duration, but timelessness, then he lives eternally who lives in the present. Our life is endless in the way that our visual field is without limit. The temporal immortality of the human soul, the temporal immortality of the human soul, that is, its eternal survival after death, is not only in no way guaranteed, but this assumption will not do for us what we have always tried to make it do. Is the riddle solved by the fact that I survive forever? Is this eternal life not as enigmatic as our present one? So there's two parts to this I want to take to task. The first is our life is endless in the way that our visual field is without limit, but our visual field has limit, and also our visual field is entirely a construction of the brain, because when our eyes scan what's in front of us, it's only taking in about 15% at most of what it sees, because what it's doing is computing for variance, stuff that shouldn't be there, stuff that potentially presents a threat to our being. It's an evolutionary, a real sort of throwback to our primitive evolution. So the visual field very much has limit. It's the limit of what is pre-constructed, so that doesn't make any sense at all. And then just go back, death is not an event of life, death is not lived through. Well, I agree with both of those, sort of. If by eternity is understood not endless temporal duration, but timelessness, I don't really understand what the difference is, unless he means that time is suspended in death, which I guess it is. Then he lives eternally who lives in the present. So that sort of has a double meaning to me, because it seems to imply that while you're alive and until you die, you are living in an eternal unendedness because you're still alive. But that doesn't really hold for me. But if he means in death that he lives eternally who lives in the present, there is no present in death because there's no consciousness, and we've already said that time doesn't hold. So none of that really makes sense to me. Okay, so this next one is by Michel de Montaigne, who I've never read, but he strikes me as the kind of philosopher that would really get on my nerves. If it be a short and violent death, we have no leisure to fear it. True dat. If otherwise, I perceive that according as I engage myself in sickness, I do naturally fall into some disdain and contempt of life. So he seems to be saying that once you're terminally ill, but it's going to take a while, that turns your whole view of life upside down and you no longer want it. I guess because you want an end to the physical suffering, but I don't buy that. Also, which diseases would prompt that and which wouldn't? It is uncertain where death looks for us. Let us expect her everywhere. The premeditation of death is a forethinking of liberty. Well, I agree with that. Well, liberty's the wrong word, but I agree with the importance of a forethinking about death. He who hath learned to die hath unlearned to serve. There is no evil in life, for him that hath well conceived how the privation of life is no evil. To know how to die doth free us from all the subjection and constraint. Well, if any of us do know how to die and are absolutely content and at one with what death means, that's possibly true. But that must be a tiny percentage of the population. Maybe some philosophers and Buddhists, and that's about it, really. And just coming back to this. He who hath learned to die hath unlearned to serve. There is no evil in life, for him that hath well conceived how the privation of life is no evil. How the privation of life is no evil. Well, evil is not the word I'd use, but the privation of life by death descending is a bit of a bum deal, I'm afraid, personally. So I call bullshit Montaigne. Dr. Boswell, talking about Samuel Johnson's attitude towards death. To my question whether we might not fortify our minds for the approach of death, he answered in a passion, "No, sir, let it alone. It matters not how a man dies, but how he lives. The act of dying is not of importance, it lasts so short a time." Well, I certainly agree with Boswell, Johnson, that, death means you should interrogate how you live your life to make it worthwhile, to make it purposeful with meaning. But that last phrase, the act of dying is not of importance, it lasts so short a time. Well, that may be true if you go quickly and without suffering, which is not true for a lot of people, but anyway. But what about the bit after the act of dying, where you're just, every beauteous thing about life, which, your consciousness perceives and is involved with, that is an eternity. That is a long time. That is of importance, I would argue. Arnold Toynbee, who actually makes 2 appearances in this video. So this is the first one. My answer to St. Paul's question, "O death, where is thy sting?" is St. Paul's own answer. The sting of death is sin. The sin that I mean is the sin of selfishly failing to wish to survive the death of someone with whose life my own life is bound up. This is selfish because the sting of death is less sharp for the person who dies than it is for the bereaved survivor. This is, as I see it, the capital fact about the relation between living and dying. There are 2 parties to the suffering that death inflicts, and in the apportionment of this suffering, the survivor takes the brunt. Well, that's true on one level, that obviously being bereaved, being grief-stricken because your loved one has departed, is a lot harder emotionally to bear than for the dead person who has nothing to bear anymore because they have no emotions, feelings or consciousness. I accept that on one level, but that doesn't rule out, I thought quite a lot about, my loved ones, am I going to die before them or are they going to die before me? And what are the implications of that? And as Andre Malraux sort of bats this away, I think quite successfully really, this point of view of Toynbee, which is, there is no death, there is only me who is going to die. That's from his book The Royal Way, which I have actually read. And Malraux is right. There is a qualitative difference between other people's deaths, which I call third-person deaths, and your own death, which I call first-person death. And third-person death can reflect back on your own mortality. I'm not saying that it can't, but it's basically taken up with feelings, emotions in life, bereavement, grief. Whereas your first-person death, your self-death, the thinking about it, contemplating about it, brings very different emotions: terror, dread. Loss of the self is different to loss of others. So I'm with Malraux rather than Toynbee on that one. Dear old Sigmund Freud, what would it be if he hadn't got in on the act of talking about death? It is indeed impossible to imagine our own death, and whenever we attempt to do so, we can perceive that we are in fact still present as spectators. Hence the psychoanalytic school could venture on the assertion that at bottom no one believes in his own death, or to put the same thing in another way, that in the unconscious every one of us is convinced of his own immortality. And that was from his Thoughts of the Times on War and Death. Well, it is impossible to imagine our own death, I agree, and whenever we attempt to do so, we can perceive that we are in fact still present as spectators. So the mere act of trying to think about your own death proves you're still alive and conscious. Well, okay, yeah, I can go with that. Hence the psychoanalytic school could venture on the assertion that at bottom no one believes in his own death. So the mere fact that you are thinking about your own death, even though we agree that it's impossible to conceptualise that, but the mere act of thinking about it, to Freud's mind and his psychoanalytic school's rubric, is therefore you deny that you could die, that you have feelings of immortality, which is ego gone mad. So that, I absolutely disagree with that. It doesn't prove that you believe in him. I think we do, believe we're immortal on some level, but not because we're thinking about our death. It's because we're not thinking about our death. Pushing death, keeping death at bay is what you know, because we're not thinking about that we could die one day, therefore the, you know, what's left in its place is the assumption that we are immortal. And also, you know, if I'm thinking, I've never water skied. If I'm thinking about water skiing, does that mean that I have water skied? Same logic to me. Okay, on to Toynbee again. Death is the price paid for life for an enhancement of the complexity of a living organism's structure. This is from Life After Death. Now, what he means by that is that the biological sophistication of moving from single-cell structures that can, to some extent, clone themselves, to complicated structures of any animal, including mankind, has a built-in obsolescence into that process of the complex physical being, of cell division, of wear and tear on organs and things like that. And I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree with that. But death isn't the price paid for life by an enhancement of the complexity of a life organism structure. You know, it is a biological process, but it makes no awareness. It takes no account of consciousness in that process. It is not, you know, death is not just about the physical process of decay. You know, there is a consciousness issue at play. So I accept that the complexity of life has led to an inbuilt obsolescence in death, but the complexity of life has given us advantages in order to pass on through inheritance into further generations. And as part of that equation is the payoff of joy, of pleasure, of sensation. That's what I mean by there's, you know, no recognition of the consciousness element. Now, strict sort of Darwinists might sort of say, well, they're only joy, pleasure, sensation, are only byproducts of this need to pass on your genes and multiply into future generations. That may be so, but that still doesn't obviate the fact that a consciousness is aware of this, and those things feed into consciousness. And straight under that Toynbee quote, we have Sigmund Freud from Beyond the Pleasure Principle. The attributes of life were at some time evoked in inanimate matter by the action of a force of whose nature we can form no conception. It may perhaps have been a process similar in type to that which later caused the development of consciousness in a particular stratum of living matter. The tension which then arose in what had hitherto been an inanimate substance endeavoured to cancel itself out. In this way, the first instinct came into being, the instinct to return to the inanimate state. That may be an instinct. I mean, you know, beyond, Thanatos, the death instinct, it may be present, but it's not the first and primary instinct to return from that state from which we came before the evolution of any kind of conscious life. So, you know, Freud, that's just, you know, cobblers. And on to Pascal, this is from his Pensées. What reason do atheists have to say that one cannot rise from the dead? Which is the more difficult, to be born or to be reborn? That which has never existed should exist, or that which has existed should exist again? It is more difficult to come into being than to return to it. Custom makes the one seem easy. Absence of custom makes the other seem impossible, a vulgar way of judging. So the problem with that is he seems to be going against genetics. You know, he's saying it's much harder to be born originally than it is to be reborn. Well, in the sense of the chance of, you know, the millions of sperm, which one's going to meet with the egg and fuse and fertilise, and for that egg to develop into a child, you know, which turns out to be you. Yeah, absolutely. The odds are humongously against it. But in terms of being reborn, there's still better odds because no one has been reborn. Maybe in the future when we clone or some transhumanist technology, that may change. But for now, and the whole history of mankind up to now, no one has ever been reborn. So he seems to be saying that, you know, because it's easier to be because he's gone the other way though. He's saying it's harder to be born in the first place than it is to be reborn. Therefore, you can't, like atheists do, you can't rule out being reborn. I mean, this is just nonsense. You know, custom makes the one seem easy. Absence of custom makes the other seem impossible. A vulgar way of judging. Well, no, custom has proved that people get born. Custom has not shown that anyone can be reborn. So it's out to lunch, I'm afraid. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. This is from Conversations with Eckermann. Every extraordinary person has a particular mission which he is called upon to fulfil. When he has accomplished it, he is no longer needed on earth in the same form, and Providence uses him for something else. I'm not quite sure what that is, but anyway. Mozart died at 36, Raphael at practically the same age, Byron was only a little older, but each of them had accomplished his mission perfectly, and it was time for them to go so that others might still have something left to do in a world created to last a long while. Well, you know, this is absolute nonsense, clearly. There may be something in the artistic psyche that leads people to die young. You know, lots of them commit suicide, for example. But Johann Wolfgang von Goethe died at age 82, which A, either disproves his own notion, or B, suggests that he wasn't a very good artist, because if he'd been a good artist, he would have been bumped off in his 30s. So I love that piece of absolute sort of, you know, myopia from Goethe. Yeah. Alexander Smith, who's not someone I've heard of, if we were to, he lived between 1830 and 1867, so he died at 37 years old. This is from Dreamthorpe. If we were to live here always, with no other care than how to feed, clothe and house ourselves, life would be a very sorry business. It is immeasurably heightened by the solemnity of death. I don't get that at all. He seems to be saying that life is very humdrum, which, you know, one could argue. And it's only death that raises life and gives it its grandeur. But if your life is just made of, you know, food, shelter, and clothing, and how, you know, keeping body and soul together, and not much else, not having pleasures and joy, how is death elevating that to a higher thing? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And finally, the Belgian author Maeterlinck, if I pronounce that right, which I probably haven't. Total annihilation is impossible. We are the prisoners of an infinity without outlet, wherein nothing perishes, wherein everything is dispersed but nothing lost. Neither a body nor a thought can drop out of the universe, out of time and space. Not an atom of our flesh, not a quiver of our nerves will go where they will cease to be, for there is no place where anything ceases to be, which is the preservation of energy. The scientific theory thereof. The brightness of a star extinguished millions of years ago still wanders in the ether, where our eyes will perhaps behold it this very night, pursuing its endless road. It is the same with all that we see, as with all that we do not see. To be able to do away with a thing, that is to say, to fling it into nothingness, nothingness would have to exist. And if it exists, under whatever form, it is no longer nothingness. So for nothingness to exist means that it can't be nothingness. That seems to be a semantic nicety which doesn't hold up. As soon as we try to analyse it, to define it, or to understand it, thoughts and expressions fail us, or create that which they are struggling to deny. It is as a contrary to the nature of our reason, and probably of all imaginable reason, to conceive nothingness as to conceive limits of infinity. Nothingness, besides, is but a negative infinity, a sort of infinity of darkness opposed to that which our intelligence strives to enlighten, or rather it is but a child name or nickname which our mind has bestowed upon that which it has not attempted to embrace. For we call nothingness all that which escapes our senses or our reason and exists without our knowledge, which is a pretty good definition of the state of death to my mind, ergo nothingness. The more that human thought rises and increases, the less comprehensible does nothingness become. In any case, and this is what matters here, if nothingness were possible, since it could not be anything whatever, it could not be dreadful. Well, again, and you know, this brings me full circle really, the state of nothingness, having had a consciousness, does make it dreadful, unfortunately, because you are going to surrender all that has made your life worthwhile. Now, it's true that people who've only had lives of suffering may very well want to, you know, for that life to end sooner rather than later and be happy with the quietus of the grave. But for a lot of people, I can't say majority, you know, who can put a figure on it, but for a lot of people, nothingness, having had somethingness, having had consciousness, is not a great trade-off, is not a great, you know, it's not a, again, I return to it, it's not a great deal. It's what I call, you know, the human condition, but it's what I call the cosmic injustice or the cosmic joke. And that's it. Those are my contrarian quotes. So I've got a list of people here who I think would make very, very interesting contributions to their favourite or least favourite quotes. Steve Donoghue, even though he doesn't watch my videos, so he won't see this and he won't know he's been tagged unless one of you gentle viewers tells him. Bookish, Dane Reads, The Weird Book Club, who I think would have some excellent takes on this. Scallydandling about the books. Silje, Bookish North, Samuel Daram, Shawn the Book Maniac, who will be very acerbic, I'm sure. Infinite Text, who for me is the queen of all things death and mortality on BookTube, so I'm particularly keen for her to do this if she sees it, because I think she can, you know, contribute to where my version of this tag came from, if she is so minded to talk about death quotes. She has a project called The Death Shelf, where she talks about books on mortality. I'm sure she must have read this, probably read that as well. So it'd be great if she would do it. Rec Me Books and Stuff, who reads a lot of non-fiction in parallel with fiction, so I think she could have lots of good stuff there. Everyone who reads it must converse. Noah, over to you. Big Hard Books and Classics, Alan. I think this could be up your street. And Todd the Librarian. Okay, so I hope this was of some interest to you, and obviously anyone else other than people I've tagged can do it. Let's get this trending for people. Okay, till next time, thanks very much.